Hello, Loft family. Now, not the most important question, but I am wondering, what are you guys doing for haircuts right now? I mean, this is kind of a problem. Last week, my millennial son said to me, "Hey, hippie, get a haircut." So I know it's time to figure this out. I'm going to let y'all decide. Next weekend, Shaggy Rob or Cowboy Rob? Which one do y'all? Just write it in the chat. Shaggy Rob, Cowboy Rob. You decide. I'll show up. Shaggy or Cowboy? Anyway. No, really, write it in. I appreciate it. Now, this weekend, we are continuing the series that we began last week titled A Place to Stand. And in this time of crisis and anxiety, we're asking the same question that David asked 3,000 years ago as he felt his own world coming apart. Psalm 11:3 says, "When the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do?" And last week, if you remember, we said that a crisis is a time of danger. It's also a time of opportunity. The danger is that we will be overwhelmed by our circumstances, we'll be filled with fear, we'll withdraw from God and from others, that maybe we'll even become angry and bitter and cynical, that will come out of this crisis further away from God, less like Jesus, not having grown at all through this difficult time. But there's also a real opportunity in a time of crisis. If you remember last week, we said that a crisis will always reveal who you are. Very important information if you want to grow closer to God. We said that a crisis can give us an opportunity to grow, unlike times that are peaceful and calm. And we also said that a crisis can remind us of what's most important. So the question is, how do we go through this time of crisis, this time of difficulty, and come out the other side better, stronger, more conformed to the image of Jesus, and closer to God? Where do we stand? What do we need to do? Well, I tell you, the first thing we need to do is get our heads right. Now, we need to do more than that if we're going to come through this crisis and come out closer to God and more conformed to Jesus and have been a blessing to others through this time. But that's the place that we need to begin. We need to get our heads right. Because the way you think about your situation will, to a large degree, determine how you respond to your situation. If you think rightly about what's going on, you are very likely to react rightly to what's going on. But if you think wrongly about your situation, it doesn't matter how sincere you are, it doesn't matter how hard you try. If you think wrongly about your situation, you're very likely to react wrongly. So the first thing we need to do is get our heads right. See this thing that we're in the middle of, see it the right way. Now, the Apostle Paul wrote to the early believers in Rome, and they were in a crisis period, different than the crisis we're facing. But they were living in a very hostile culture. And some of them were being persecuted for their faith, and they had to determine how they were going to respond. And all of them felt the pressure of the empire, the pressure of their culture, trying to reform them, trying to get their values no longer to reflect Christ and their faith, but to reflect the culture and its views. And there was this tremendous force trying to reshape them into the image of the empire, the image of the culture. And Paul gives them really good advice about how to go through that critical time that they were facing. This is Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Paul wrote, "I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, so holy and pleasing to God." So that's the goal. I'm going to give you some advice. I'm going to tell you how to live in such a way that your life honors Christ and reflects well on God. He says, "This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world. Don't give in, but be transformed." How? By the renewing of your mind. Get your head right. Think rightly about the situation that you're in. And the result is what? Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So in the midst of a crisis, it is important that we see what's going on around us in the right way, the way that Christ sees it. Now, when we're going through a difficult time, when we're struggling, when we feel overwhelmed by our circumstances, it's very easy for our thoughts to start racing. We even have the expression, his thoughts ran away with him. And when our thoughts run away with us, they almost never take us to a good place. They take us to a place of darkness and doubt and despair. They take us to a place of negativity and anger. So if we're going to get our heads right, two important insights for you. First of all, you must say to yourself, I can control my thought life. It may take discipline, it may take work, but I can overcome the tendency of my thoughts to run away with me. I can corral my thoughts. I can focus them on the things that will give me strength and peace and that will build faith in me. I can control my thought life. I must control my thought life. So that's what I want to talk with you about in this message. How we can go through this time and how we can place ourselves mentally. How we can find a place to stand mentally with our thinking that allows us to go through this difficult time and come out better, stronger, more conformed to the image of Jesus, having been a blessing to others and closer to God. So the first place I would tell you to stand mentally is this, a place of proper perspective. When going through difficult, challenging times, our thoughts begin to race. They tell us things like, I shouldn't have to go through this. This isn't right. This isn't fair. And all of those thoughts may be right, but none of those thoughts will help you move forward in a way that is faithful to Jesus and that leads you to a place that is positive, a place of real strength. We need to have a place of proper perspective. And the place of proper perspective is this: life is difficult. It's difficult for all of us, and we shouldn't expect it to be any different. M. Scott Peck put it so well in his modern-day classic, The Road Less Traveled. He said, life is difficult. This is a great truth, one of the greatest truths. Most do not fully see this truth that life is difficult. Instead, they moan more or less incessantly, noisily or subtly, about the enormity of their problems, their burdens, and their difficulties, as if life were generally easy, as if life should be easy. They voice their belief, noisily or subtly, that their difficulties represent a unique kind of affliction that should not be, and that has somehow been visited upon them. Life is a series of problems. See, somehow we've gotten it into our heads, whether we admit it or not, we've gotten into our heads that life is supposed to run fairly smoothly. It's supposed to go pretty much according to plan, and life is supposed to be fair. And when it's not any of those things, we feel like something's wrong. Someone is picking on us. God is picking on us, or the devil's picking on us, or life or the world's picking on us because something is wrong. It's not supposed to be this way. What's wrong is the assumption that life is somehow supposed to be relatively easy, free of problems, and run according to plan. That's not life. Life is not supposed to be one way or another. Life just is. And life comes to us, and it's our job to live it. You want to get through this time? Then the proper perspective is life is difficult. Parenting is difficult. I'm sorry nobody told you that before you decided to bring a little human being into the world that you're responsible for, and responsible for a long time. I think at least 5 or 6 years you have to be responsible for them. Ours are older and I forget. But it's a long time you got to be responsible for these lives that you bring into the world. Watching someone you love suffer is difficult. A good marriage is difficult, even in the best of times. Some of us, our marriages have gotten more difficult over the last 5 weeks, right? How's that 24/7 thing working out for you? I've loved the memes that have come out during this pandemic. One meme, 2 women talking. One says, hey, neighbor, just checking, how are y'all doing? The other woman says, doing fine. Hey, haven't seen your husband around since the quarantine. Oh, he's in the backyard in the garden. Really? I can see your backyard from here. I don't see him in the garden. Well, you just have to dig a little bit. Another one I like that was sent to us, a guy in the church. He said, this quarantine is so difficult, especially for my wife. She is such a people person. I see her just staring through the front window of the house, and she looks so lonely, and she's crying, and I just wish I could do something to help her. I've even thought about letting her back inside, but rules are rules. So marriage is difficult, even more so during this pandemic. Now, it turns out not so much at my house, because my wife and my son, who lives with us, they've discovered that having around 24/7, actually, I'm a pretty charming fellow. 2 or 3 hours a day, didn't know it, but now that I'm there all the time, turns out I'm a real treat. Yeah, well, but just one of you is married to me, so the rest of us may be finding that this is a real difficult time. Marriage in the best of times, a good marriage, is always difficult. Now maybe even harder. Growing old is difficult. Losing money is difficult. Losing a job is difficult. Going through a pandemic is difficult. Being a faithful follower of Jesus is difficult. And you know what that's called? It's called life. And life is unpredictable, uncontrollable, unfair, and difficult for every one of us. When Peggy and I and our boys were living in Atlanta, Texas, one of the couples that we got to know there were the Duggars, Morris and Eula. We really loved them and enjoyed getting to know them. They were older than we were. Morris had been a colonel in the United States Army. And he told me that he was once having a conversation with some younger officers. And they were telling him, Colonel Duggar, you just don't understand how it is. Things are different than your day. You don't understand. He said, oh, really? Why do I not understand? And the younger officer said, well, these young soldiers that we're getting, a lot of them, they didn't grow up with the same kind of discipline as young people did in your time. And they don't have the same respect for authority as people did in your time. And we have men and women together in the Army now, and that creates a whole new dynamic. I mean, just all due respect, Colonel, but you don't understand what it's like. And Morris told me, he looked at him and he said, well, boys, I understand this. It's always difficult when it's your turn. And it's our turn to live life right now. And it's difficult. But you know what? Life has always been difficult. Life was difficult during the Great Recession. Life was difficult after 9/11. Life was difficult when I was a first grader and children my age were told how to get under their desk and protect themselves in case a nuclear bomb might hit. Life was difficult during the Cold War. Life was difficult during World War II. Life was difficult during the Depression. Life was difficult during the Civil War. Life was difficult during the Revolutionary War. Life has always been difficult, even in this country. We're not having some special, terrible visitation dropped upon us. It's just our turn to live life. And look, not everything that looks good that happens to you is a blessing, and not everything that looks bad that happens to you is a curse. That's not the way to see it. I think you'll see it on the screen, proper perspective. My problems are not unique. My problems are a challenge and an opportunity for spiritual and emotional growth. If you can get a place of proper perspective, you've not been singled out. Life may be difficult, but it's always been difficult. If you can get a place of proper perspective, not let your thoughts run away with you, you're going to be able to get through this and be just fine. Now, there's a second place that we need to stand mentally, and that is in a place of faith. Look with me, Romans 8:28. Paul wrote, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Now, the promise here is not that everything that happens is God's will. The promise is not that everything that happens is really good if you just look at it the right way. The promise is that even in a world that is full of evil, And even in the midst of your life, when it's full of pain and suffering and struggles that you may not understand, even then, God is in the midst of it. He's in the midst of that world. He's in the midst of your life, and he is working for your good. Now, some of you, I'm sure, maybe all of you, have seen an episode or more of The Wheel of Fortune. I checked on Google. Wheel of Fortune has been on television for 45 years. Crazy. And you know how it works. You spin the wheel, you guess a letter, you buy a vow, and then slowly the puzzle is revealed. And you come up with the answer. You understand what was hidden. And that's how some of us want to play the game of life. We think, I'm going through this difficult time and I don't see what God is doing. If I could just start putting some of the clues together, if it would just start coming into focus, if I could just guess what God is doing, if I could see it, then I could hold on in faith. Look, we believe in God. We don't believe in our ability to figure out what God is doing. We walk in faith because we trust in God's promises, not because we can discern God's plan. And if you and I are going to come through this time of crisis, come out stronger, better, more like Jesus, then we have got to decide that we are going to trust that God is in the midst of our lives, he's in the midst of our world, and he is working for our good. Now, we all go through difficult times when it doesn't feel that way. You have and I have, and those are horrible times, but they are a part of life. There are times when it feels like maybe God has forgotten us. Maybe God's not working on our behalf. We go through really dark times emotionally and sometimes spiritually. We just celebrated Good Friday and Easter. And you remember the darkest moment this world has ever had. The disciples, they see Jesus taken away. He's nailed to a cross, and they're wondering, where is God? Why doesn't God do something? It shouldn't be this way. And of course, 2,000 years later, we know God was doing something. As a matter of fact, he was doing something so wondrous. If they had bought every vowel in the alphabet and put it on that puzzle, they still wouldn't have figured out what God was doing. Where was God? He was right there in their midst. He was right there on the cross, in the darkness, in the pain, in the suffering, working for their good. And God was using the darkest moment this world has ever known to bring about the greatest, most glorious good this world has ever seen. You can trust that God is working in your life even when you don't see it, even when you don't feel it. Why? Because God has promised. In all things, he's working for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. Some of you will know that before Peggy and I came here, that I had the privilege of being on staff at First Methodist Church in Houston and working for the senior pastor, Bill Henson. Before I went to that church, Bill was a hero of mine, and when I left that church, Bill was even more a hero of mine. Bill retired in 2001, and he lived for 3 years before a massive stroke took his life at the age of 68. Now, Bill was a man of immense strength. He had a strong faith. He was committed to his principles. He was very willing to take unpopular, even controversial stands for the gospel. And really, the best I could tell, it just did not bother him that he had to pay a price to be true to his conscience and to what God had revealed. And when I knew him, Bill had a very tender side. This was later in his life, but he had a very tender side. When he'd sit me down for our annual job review, he had no problem in the world telling me where I needed to improve, what I'd done wrong. He could just very straightforwardly put that out there. Once I remembered, he was so frank with me. I said, does this bother you at all to put it out there just like that? Nope, not at all. But at the end of each one of those, he'd look me right in the eyes, and then he'd say, Rob, I love you. I talked with some of the other associate pastors that had worked for Bill when he was younger there at First Methodist. And I told them, Bill says, I love you. They just shook their heads and said, well, he's changed. That's not the Bill I knew. And Bill had changed. Bill, before he came to First Methodist Church in Houston, he was a pastor in Georgia. And very often he was assigned to a church that was struggling, that was having problems. And Bill, by the force of his personality, by the power of his preaching, and he was a most inspiring preacher. By his unparalleled work ethic, he would just strap that church onto his back, and with his own strength, he would just pull it forward until it was healthy and vibrant. And as soon as he got it into a really good place, the bishop would take him away from that church and send him back to another church that needed that done all over again, and he'd go to work, and he'd do the very same thing. And then he thought all of that was over. All those difficult days were over when he was sent to First Methodist Church in Houston. The only problem was that church was not all that it had been presented to Bill as. There were all kinds of problems: financial problems, property problems, morale problems, staff problems. And here he was having to do it all over again, only on a much bigger, more difficult stage. And to make things worse, this was in the early and then the mid-'80s, and not like today, but there was a huge oil bust then, and people, downtown was nothing like it was right before the lockdown. It was not vibrant. There were no ballparks down there, no stadiums. There were no real restaurants. It was a ghost town after 5 o'clock, and nobody wanted to drive into the city to go to church downtown. And for the first time in his life, Bill could not strap a church onto his back, work hard, and make it thrive, make it healthy. Now, I heard Bill tell this story publicly, so I can tell it to you. This was deadly to Bill's spirit. He'd always been successful. Work hard, believe in God, love people, and things will happen, things will grow, things will get better. He did everything he had ever done, and none of it worked. And he really came into a very dark place. He became very depressed. He lost weight. He couldn't sleep. He started taking medication for depression, and he saw a counselor. I heard him tell this story to a group of young pastors who loved and adored him as I did. And the fact that he was so open and honest about his struggles just made me admire and love him more. And things got so bad that Bill told me that after an 11 o'clock service one Sunday, everybody was gone. And he went down to the altar of that beautiful sanctuary. And he knelt down at the altar all by himself, and he began to weep. He said, I can't do this, God. I give up. I take my hands off of this church. It's not my church anymore, it's your church. You do with it whatever you want. You want it to succeed? Wonderful. You make it succeed. You want it to fail? Fine, let it fail. But I let go. This is your church, not mine. Now, slowly, Bill's depression began to lift. And he began to experience a real sense of joy in life again. He was able to give himself permission not to work so many hours, to spend more time at home, to spend more time enjoying people. And he began to have a freedom to love people in a way that he'd never had, even to tell people like me, I love you. And people said his preaching, always powerful, it became characterized by a depth of empathy and compassion that they had never seen before. Where was God in that darkness? Bill wondered, God, why have you brought me here? Why have you brought me here to fail? Where was God? He was right there. What was God doing? He was doing a most marvelous work in Bill's life. He was making a great man even greater. He was making an inspirational preacher even more powerful. He was making a believer more like his Savior. He was making a man's heart completely tender. And he was giving him an ability to love in ways he had never loved before. Friends, there are going to come times in our lives when we can have every vowel, every consonant in the alphabet, and we still cannot put them together in a way that makes sense of what is going on. And it's in those moments that we've got to say, I don't trust in God because I can figure out what he's doing. I trust in God because I know God. I know he's faithful. I know he's good. I know he's loving. I know his promise. In all things, he is working for my good. And friends, if you can trust that, if you can get your mind to a place of faith, if you can keep your head and believe in God regardless of what your circumstances are saying, you're going to find the strength to come through this time, to end up more like Jesus, be a blessing to others, and end up closer to God. One last place I would tell you to stand, and that is in a place of gratitude. Now, that may sound a little strange to you when so many of us have lost so much. But I'm convinced that if we're going to go through this difficult time and come out the other side better, we have got to be grateful for what we have. We can spend our time thinking about what we've lost. That's going to lead to fear and worry, negativity, maybe bitterness, or we can concentrate on what we have been given, the blessings that we enjoy. And if we do that, then we're going to come through this time just fine. So when you have problems, when you're going through a crisis, this pandemic or in your marriage or with a child or health, whatever it may be, when you're going through a crisis and the negative news just keeps coming, that can determine your whole reality. And what it does, it puts pressure on your spirit to give up. But if you can overcome, if you can say to yourself, but I've been given so much, and if that's where you can put your thoughts, you're going to discover that your spirit is revived and you will not fail or falter. Now, Paul wrote in his book to the Philippians, he wrote this word, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So Paul says, when you're going through a difficult time, when you're tempted to be anxious and worried, present your prayers, your requests to God. And he says, with thanksgiving. And the promise is, then God's peace that transcends all understanding will come into your life and will guard your heart and your mind. Now, here's something that I know to be true. There is power in praise. There is strength in gratitude. There is victory in being thankful for what you've been given and for the fact that you can count on God to go with you no matter what comes. When you are able to be grateful in the midst of a crisis, you're looking at your circumstances, you're looking at your situation, and you're saying, you do not have power over me. You will not determine my attitude. You will not form my spirit. You will not take from me the joy that is mine in Jesus Christ. When you are grateful, you are raising your fist. You are declaring that you are free of the control of your circumstances because you are under the control of a loving and gracious God that you count on. So what I want to encourage you, challenge you to do for the next 7 days until we meet again, I'm going to encourage you every day, maybe best when you get up in the morning, but whatever time works for you, write down 3 things that you're grateful for. 3 things that God has done for you, 3 things that you can see God is doing for you, or 3 things that you believe God will do for you because he's promised that he'll do those things for you. Write down 3 things every day. Get by yourself. Get to a place where you can pray out loud. This will be new for some of us. Do it. Pray out loud, thanking God, being grateful for the blessings that you have listed that day. And you just watch. Your spirit will begin to be set free. It will begin to soar. You, instead of feeling pressured and pushed down, you will begin to rise above everything that has come against you. It's a promise. The peace of God that transcends all understanding will come into your life. Do you know when Paul wrote these words? When he was in prison, when he was awaiting a trial that he knew could very well end with the order for him to be executed. And what does he say? Make your request known to God with thanksgiving, and the peace of God will fill your hearts. As a matter of fact, this little book of Philippians, here, Paul's in prison. He's facing a trial, may end up being executed, and yet this little book is known as Paul's epistle of joy. Paul, in the most dire of times, the biggest crisis he would ever face, he's able to live with peace and contentment and joy. And one of his secrets was being grateful. So write down 3 things every day and be grateful for that. I am grateful for so many things. I'm grateful that I'm part of a church that's full of loving and affirming and encouraging people. You write so many things, not just for me, but for the rest of our team on the feed, whether it's YouTube or Facebook. And we delight in those things. We really do. But I get to be part of a church full of people who are loving and gracious, people who are affirming and encouraging. I get to spend my life with you. That's the life God has given me. How could it be better? How could I be more blessed? I get to be part of a church that really cares about people, a church that even now is doing its best to be a blessing to people who are struggling both here and all around the world. I mean, this past week, 3 days, there was a blood drive right here in the loft. Why? Because that's who we are, because we care about people. We look for ways to help people in difficult times. I went to my office here a couple times this week. We tried to stay away. We're doing a very good job of that, but I had to be up here. And the only other person who was in our office area was John Hull, our missions pastor. And I walked by John's door, and he's talking on the phone to a man by the name of Peter Pereira. Peter, I know Peter. He is a pastor in India. He runs an orphanage. He oversees a ministry that has planted literally thousands of churches in India. He's one of our heroes. And I'd spoken with Peter earlier in the week. And he told me how difficult it was in India, that people literally are starving to death, some of them. That people have been told in big cities they've got to return to their villages, and so they're taking off with almost no provisions, walking 50 miles, 100 miles, some of them dying along the way. Peter's saying that his pastors, these young pastors that look to him, that their salary comes through his ministry, that they have nothing. And how desperate the situation was, how much he cared for them. So I walk by John's door, he's talking to Peter, and I hear him say, "Hey, Peter, our missions committee met last night, and I just want you to know we're going to be sending $10,000 to you so you can care for people who have nothing and for your pastors." Long pause. Long pause. Later, John told me that Peter had to pull his car off the road. And he wept for 10 minutes because literally that morning they had run out of everything and didn't know how in the world they would provide for people who were depending on them. This church was an answer to that prayer. And then John said, "Oh, hey, I got 7 more calls just like that one to make to ministries all over the world that are caring for the poor." I'm grateful to be part of a church like ours. I'm grateful that I have a Bible to read. Believe it or not, most Christians in this world don't have a Bible. I'm grateful for a father who worked hard to provide for me. and who set before me a model of integrity to follow. I am grateful for a mother who loved me, who invested her life in me, and who was my biggest cheerleader. I am grateful for a youth director one summer, Eddie Wills, who brought me to real faith in Jesus. I am grateful for a wife who was loving and giving and forgiving and kind. I am grateful for 2 sons who have brought me immense joy. I am grateful that God has made me a minister of the gospel, the good news that our God believes in second chances, that our God is a redeemer, that no one who is lost is unloved by our God. Everything that's most important in this world, I've been given. And many of you could say the very same thing. And the right response is to be grateful. And when you realize that the most important things in the world are yours, things that the world cannot give you, things that the world cannot take from you, then all of a sudden your heart begins to be filled with gratitude. Your spirit begins to soar, and the problems that seem so great, they don't seem quite as necessary to worry about anymore. So I encourage you, 3 things each day. Write them out. Pray about them out loud. Friends, the first thing to do in the midst of this crisis is get our heads right. Mentally stand in the right place. Stand in a place of proper perspective. Life is hard. This is just our turn. Stand in a place of faith. God is working on our behalf. God will bring good out of this. You can count on that. Believe that. Act on that. And then finally, stand in a place of gratitude. Tell your circumstances, you don't control my spirit. You do not control whether or not I will praise the God who saved me and who has given me so much. Stand there, and you're going to come through this. You're going to be just fine. Let's pray together. Gracious God, we are immensely grateful that you've revealed yourself to us in Jesus Christ. And in him, we see that you are loving and compassionate. In him, we see that you are a miracle worker. In him, we see that you are God of second chances. In him, we see that you are God who does not give up, who does not walk away, but that will remain true to us, even if it requires his life. Lord, I pray that you'd help me, and I pray that you would help everyone who's listening, watching today. I pray that you would help all of us to get our heads right, to raise our heads, to look on high from whence comes our help. And Lord, help us to walk in faith, in faithfulness, and in victory. We pray it in Christ's name. Amen.